You're listening to the Rule of Life podcast by Practicing the Way. In each season, we explore an ancient practice from the way of Jesus and its relevance for the modern era. This is Season 1, Sabbath. Hey everyone, John Mark here. Okay, we are officially done with our 4-episode Sabbath podcast that was designed to go along with our 4-session Sabbath practice. And again, thank you to the generosity of the Circle who made all of this possible, as well as to Brian and Bethany Allen for their rich conversation, and to all of our special guests. But before we go silent for a while, and we hope to be back in mid-January with Season 2 on prayer. But until then, we wanted to give you 2 more offerings. Throughout my conversations with Brian and Bethany, we have been playing short snippets of long-form interviews that we did with a few luminary thinkers, including Tish Harrison Warren. Now we want to offer you that interview in its full length. Tish is a native of Austin, Texas. She's also a priest in the Anglican Church, as well as the author of 2 books, Liturgy of the Ordinary, Sacred Practices in Everyday Life, which is hands down the best book I've ever read on spiritual formation and what she calls the cussedness of ordinary life. She's also the author of Prayer in the Night, her most recent work, which is absolutely beautiful for those living through a dark night of the soul or just a season of pain and suffering. She's also an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, as well as a prolific writer. She is one of my favorite living writers, in formation in particular, but just in general, a great thinker and an all-around lovely soul. So, whatever you're up to, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Tish as much as I did. Well, Tish, thank you so much for coming on, and so many questions I want to ask you. I'm going to discipline myself to limit it to a selection, but I'd love to start with your book, Liturgy of the Ordinary. You know, I love reading your column for the New York Times, but I came to your work first through your 2 books, and I just have such an affinity for anybody writing in the kind of broad stream of spiritual formation, which I think, right or wrong, I would kind of place you somewhere on that map. And I would just love to hear what brought you to that. You know, at the risk of stereotyping, most people who write in that space of formation and kind of the inner life and the growth of the soul over a lifespan tend to be really old and really introverted. And that's not a criticism of them. It's just an observation. You know, it tends to be an introverted intellectual boomer. And you are blisteringly intelligent and all of that, but you're my age. You have little kids. How old are your children? 12 down to 2, is that right?
Yeah, 12, 9, and 2.
Exactly. So, you know, you're writing about formation, especially Liturgy of the Ordinary, which was, I don't know what year you wrote that in, but your kids would have been younger at that point. So you're writing with kids at your feet, you know. So I find that fascinating. Talk to me about what brought you to write about that topic as your first book? What brought you into that conversation, into that stream of the Christian tradition?
Man, this one question could take up the entire time we have together, I feel like. So I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and from a pretty early age, I wanted to know Jesus, like and now looking back, like a weird way for the age I was. You know, spiritual things were really important to me and compelling. And some of this is like I had some like hard stuff happening in my home life, but I think that God became very real to me and also very compelling, like alluring in some very specific ways. And so I remember, even as a really young kid, I was in high school, but I asked my youth minister at my church, like, how do I stop sinning? Like how do I cut this out? Like let's go ahead and nip this in the bud and stop sinning. And it was a little arrogant.
He'd give you a Bible study and just study this and you're done. And then just stop.
Give me the 5 steps to not sin. And he said, die. That was his answer, which is true. But even that question shows a few things. Number one, I understood the Christian life is primarily about not sinning, right? That is not what the Christian life is about. Primarily, although of course, sanctification is part of the Christian life, but intimacy with Jesus is more than just not sinning. Also, so it showed a pretty shallow understanding of what sin was. Sin is these bad choices we make as opposed to...
Yeah, individual behavior choices, yeah.
Yeah. As opposed to something like deeper with my heart and societal and
not just with you. I love to think about sin in like the 3 dimensions of, sin done by us, sin done to us, and sin done around us, So it's your heart and it's mine and it's a whole bunch of other people all mashed up together. Keep going.
Yeah. And institutional sin and ways that I'm involved in systems of evil. I mean, it just gets more and more, right? But it also showed in there somewhere was hidden a question of formation. How does human beings change? I believe the right things, but it doesn't seem to be taking away the things in my life that seem amiss.
And did you grow up at all, Tish? I was never Baptist, but I grew up in that kind of West Coast evangelical Bible church kind of era of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And nobody ever said this, and they were intelligent enough not to, but the kind of unspoken theory of change that I picked up was basically more church attendance and Bible study equals less sin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And at some point, if you grow up in that, I think you began to realize the bankruptcy of that paradigm of formation. Not that it's bad. Those are both really good things. It's just that it's insufficient for deep change and healing and transformation. So I don't know. I felt like at some point I realized, wait a minute, I'm doing lots of church and lots of Bible study, and I still can't stop criticizing my wife, or whatever the besetting sin is.
Yeah, I think it was a few. So yes to the more church attendance and more quiet times, more time in scripture. But also, I think there was a sense of the will. And around it was kind of if we could sort of get to the right emotional place. So this is seen like in...
Then willpower could just go do it.
Youth camps, if we get everyone crying on the last night and giving their life to Jesus again, rededicating for like the 50th time, then this time it'll sort of take. And then I kind of had this is a whole other story, but had a kind of crisis of faith in college. Ended up asking a lot of theological questions, ended up becoming a Presbyterian, which was good in the sense that what really drew me to the church I was in was the idea of grace. I had grown up in the church kind of wanting to know Jesus, but knowing very little of sin and grace. And so when I encountered the doctrine of grace, it sort of like, and it exploded my understanding of Christianity. It was like going from black and white to color. But that said, there also could be in certain circles, not primarily in the folks that were really discipling me, but in certain circles that I ended up drawing from and picking up on, the idea that like, if you can get your theology right, then you'll, as you say, like stop criticizing your spouse. And then, I got married. I went to seminary.
And that just sounds kind of like the Presbyterian version of the evangelical, more Bible study, church, and quiet time, which again, I'm for all of those. They are all in my rule of life, but
right, exactly.
You need more.
And theology matters. Doctrine matters so much. The things that we believe matter. But I was at some point, I was in seminary. I was feasting on like the greatest, intellectual works of the faith, married to my husband, who has a PhD in religion with a focus on church history. We were living by Harvard. So every single one of our elders in our church had a PhD. And we're the greatest scholars in the world. I remember we wanted to teach a class on like Christianity and Islam. And we were like, oh, literally the preeminent scholar on earth on this subject goes to our church. So maybe, he should probably lead this Bible or lead this small group or whatever. So, and we were still, mired in selfishness. And at some point I realized like, man, we have all the right answers, but I have no idea what it means to kind of be transformed, but also things like what does the way we use our bodies have to do with the faith? Like, how is faith more than just kind of intellectual assent or willing ourselves to, not get drunk, not have an affair, that sort of thing. So this is another long story, but around this time, we kind of accidentally ended up in an Anglican church. And I think that sort of through the liturgy itself, but also through beginning to experiment with spiritual practices like received prayer, using my posture, my body in ways of worship, the church calendar, and just all sort of the gifts of the historic church, the Eucharist, the means of grace, baptism. All of these became much more important to me, but also kind of like, man, it felt like breadcrumbs that I could follow that lead me to Jesus. And so it was this new sort of world that, man, Christians have been thinking about this for a long time. And I still am not sure that I had the language of formation. The first time I encountered that was in the writings of a woman named Dorothy Bass, who writes on spiritual practices. And I think that was literally the first time I'd like used the language of Christian practice. And that was incredibly helpful for me. And then reading James K.A. Smith and his Desiring the Kingdom. And when he describes how Christianity has come sort of, how it understands the human person as, he uses the language of a brain on a stick, like, we are brains and we primarily need to get the right information into our head and then we'll change.
Not Christianity. You're saying like post-Enlightenment Western Christianity.
Right. This is how Christianity is it was like largely understood in the context that I had been in.
Yes, exactly. But it's not actually historic Orthodox Christianity.
Yes, that's right. And so, and it's just a deeply deficient understanding of the human person. I mean,
yes. What's his line? You can't think your way to Christ-likeness. I think that's Smith's line.
And in defense of the church, this view of the human person as brain on the stick was adopted by Western Christianity, but that's a broad understanding of the Enlightenment. I mean, you could be an atheist, a deist. You basically, if you like grew up in America post-Enlightenment, that's kind of the
our whole Western education system is built around that.
Yep. That's exactly
assumption.
Right.
Yeah.
So reading Jamie gave me a paradigm and a language for understanding formation that began to make sense of what I was already doing, like participating in through my local Anglican church. And those kind of came together at my life at this around the same time. And so with that synergy, I think I was really transformed. And I think I'm from Texas, of two, kind of working class Texas parents. I've always been pretty practical. I've always wanted to know, like, so what's this cash out as? What's this look like with long sleeves on? And so I loved theology and the study of theology. I still love theology and the study of theology, but I've always sort of sat with the question of, okay, so what's this look like? What does this cash out as? What's this look like in community? And so being able to talk about theology through the lens of formation and practice became, it just became unbelievably helpful for me. It kind of anchored me in the daily experience of Christian faith in a way that I deeply needed and had been wrestling with, I think, for years and years and years without language for that. So it's a long story. The way Liturgy, the Ordinary comes into that is I was struggling with the idea, and I kind of talk about this in the book, but, I was also from a Christian subculture, sort of different one, that was like, we're going to like do big things for Jesus. We're going to like live among the poor. Like we're going to be, radical. And, it's the late. This was a big thing in the 90s. We were all going to, we were all like, not like those old stodgy Christians. We were like,
we're going to bring Keith Green back.
So I spent some time overseas. I worked with the homeless, which I still really love. I think Christians are very much called to. But I was in a season where my life looked pretty ordinary and pretty mundane, and kind of the like edgy, cool kind of Christian faith wasn't like available to me because I was keeping 2 small children alive. And so I just realized I have no idea what it means to follow Jesus in the context I'm in.
And you're saying, like, as a young mom living a more, quote, normal life.
Yep. Yeah.
As opposed to when you were single or you were at seminary, you were traveling the world, or you were working with the poor. How does that, when you're cleaning Cheerios out of the couch, how do you follow Jesus there? Yeah.
And I know this is like a common, there's a whole genre of kind of like God in the laundry books. But I read some of the books that are good and helpful about kind of, ordinary life in God. And it was all sort of like, it felt like a pep talk that your ordinary life mattered. But I was asking these questions of, but why? But how? What's it like? In other words, this doesn't help me as I'm like folding laundry or changing a diaper to just think like this matters to Jesus, like as a mantra. And so I was like, what does this actually mean that ordinary life matters? And is that kind of the comfort of the sellouts, and what sort of began to answer that question for me is the idea of formation. Ordinary life is the site of our formation. I mean, ordinary life is inescapable. Go live in Calcutta among the poorest of the poor. I have friends who have done this and do it for more than a few weeks. And what you realize is it's ordinary life. It becomes ordinary life. And so all of us have to figure out what's it mean to kind of be formed in our actual lived reality.
That's what I love about your book. You're not just saying ordinary life matters. You're saying ordinary life has latent potential in it to be the seedbed of our formation into the image of Jesus. That's a different message.
Yeah. And in fact, the only place that we're going to find the seedbed of our formation is in our actual lived lives.
What's the Willard line? God is yet to bless anybody other than where they actually are.
That's right. I think I quote that in the book, and that's right.
Maybe that's where I got it.
That's where the book sprang from, is me figuring out what does it mean to be blessed in the place I actually am, as opposed to the place that I think is more spiritual or the place that I should be. What does formation look like here? And so that's kind of where the book came from.
For those of you who have not read the book, it's fantastic. First of two, but I have your table of contents open in front of me, and it's chapter 1, walking; 2, making the bed; 3, brushing teeth; 4, losing keys; 5, eating leftovers. You just walk through like a day in the life of a average kind of person, and talk about how do we repurpose our ordinary life into the crucible of our formation.
The Sabbath practice is a 4-week experience designed to be run in your church, small group, or community that combines teaching, conversation, and spiritual exercises to introduce you to this ancient discipline for life with God. If you come on the Sabbath practice, you will not just learn about the Sabbath, you will practice the Sabbath. The end goal is to integrate Sabbath into your rule of life in order to arrange your life around God. This offering is completely free thanks to the generosity of The Circle, a group of people from all over the world who give monthly to Practicing the Way. Available now at practicingtheway.org.
Have you read Ronald Rollheiser's short little book, Domestic Monastery?
Yeah. Okay, if I'm being totally honest.
It's okay if you haven't.
I own it, and I've read like the first 2 chapters.
Okay. It's so good. I read it and read it again. And that Christmas, when it first came out a few years ago, I think I bought 10 copies and I gave it to every single friend I have who has young kids, and it's all about kind of how do we mix the domestic and the monastic, monastic just meaning the broader kind of a deep life of prayer, formation, and domestic life. Like you have children and you're running a family. And he tells this great story about some famous Italian monk. I cannot remember the name off the top of my head, who went away into a hermitage for 30 years and basically spent 3 decades mostly alone in contemplative prayer, and then came back and began to spend some time with his, by then, elderly mother. And he realized that his mother was both more godly and more loving and more contemplative than he was. And she'd raised, I think it was 6 kids. So she spent a couple of decades raising children. He spent a couple of decades alone in a hermitage. And his conclusion was, she's more like Christ than I am. And I just think hidden in that is, the lie that if you can't become a monk or a nun or in 90s, a radical Christian or whatever it is now, then you can't reach your potential in the image of Jesus. And that's just, it's a lie, and it is debilitating as well, and so that's what I love. I think a big part of my work, and this is why I have such an affinity for yours, is like so many people before me, I came into kind of the learnings of the monastic tradition when I already had a wedding ring on, and it wasn't even not that I would do it differently, but it wasn't even an option for me to go become a Benedictine monk or whatever by the time I was into all the stuff and just drinking from that well. So my question is, all right, how do we take this wealth of wisdom, which really is just serious discipleship to Jesus, and how do we contextualize it for somebody that's got a 2-year-old at home and is writing for the New York Times, or somebody that has 3 teenagers in their house and is in the process of moving, and, for ordinary life, what does this look like in a domestic setting with little kids in a city, in a secular city out in the country, and that's where your work is just extraordinarily helpful, just reimagining kind of the ordinariness of life as a sacred experience, as a sacred practice, I think is the language you use. So I think a question for you, you have a great line. So much of life unavoidably is just maintenance. Things need upkeep or they fall apart. We spend most of our days and much of our energy simply staving off inevitable entropy and decay. And you are so right. Right before this, I just finished meeting a roofer. Apparently there's some problems with our roof because I didn't know you're supposed to have a roofer come out every year and like re-drill these things. We have a metal roof on our place. And I just thought, that is such a pain. And he's saying I need to clean it twice a year and clean the gutter twice a year. I'm like, it's so much work and money if I want to pay it, But so much of life is maintenance. You use the analogy of making the bed in the morning and how utterly irrational that is, which even as a neat freak, I could not agree more. How do you repurpose? There's some talk in the kind of secular world about how to repurpose maintenance, washing the dishes, doing laundry into rituals, kind of for emotional well-being. But how do you repurpose them as, in your language, sacred practices, as means of grace?
Yeah. I mean, I struggle with this a lot. Part of the reason that I keep writing on this stuff is because I'm just like the worst at it. I mean, people expect when they meet
I so
me.
resonate. Don't ever write a book on slowing down and living an unhurried life. Then talk about a shadow that you then have to live under.
Man, I think this is probably good for your listeners to hear. The Christian writers I know, and honestly, the best Christian writers I know, always end up writing out of their struggles, not out of our expertise.
What's the David Brooks line? I'm always trying to write myself into a better life.
Yeah, absolutely. We're writing to figure something out. And so when people meet me, when people like come into my home, they're always like a little disappointed because they expect, like this, my home is essentially like the contemplative space of a monastery. My children come in, it's noon prayer time.
They ring a little bell.
Exactly. And it's nothing like that. I mean, I think I struggle more than your average person with just what Walker Percy called the cussedness of life. I think I'm undone by the cussedness of life more than your average person. And so to the extent where it's almost like like how can God be good and we have to keep working on the damn roof every year? And what does it mean? I mean, like I said, if I grew up in a place where Christianity is sort of attaining this emotional state of a sense of intimacy with God, what's that look like in all of the just deep everydayness and disappointment, and even the most like lovely and beautiful life.
Wow, that's really insightful.
So I think I struggle with your question, but I do think Greg Peters has this great analogy. He has a book called The Monkhood of All Believers.
Is he the same guy that wrote the story of monasticism book?
Maybe.
That Greg Peters, Biola Prof?
Maybe. I think he's in Ashoda now, but I'm not sure. He's a professor, so it's probably the same.
I read his like academic book. I've not read this one.
But I love the idea of the monkhood of everyone, because it's taken, of course, it's a play on the priesthood of all believers.
Yeah.
But his idea is that we all, whether we know it or not, have a rule of life. And he tells a story in the book where where a monk is talking to a married man who says, I'm not a monk, I'm married. And he essentially says, your marriage vows are a rule of life. The life that you live, the vocation you have, all determine your rule, just like a monk has a rule. And so he says, it's not that you're not a monk, it's just if we don't like own the ways that we have taken on a rule, that we are like monks, we're not monks, we're just bad monks. And
we're not being formed, we're being badly formed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So I think I still very much struggle with what it means to kind of meet Jesus in the maintenance of our life. But that is where God is. I mean, I know God meets us in moments of ecstasy and beauty, and God meets us in depths of despair. But the vast majority of our life is not in those places. And so if we're sort of waiting for those experiences to meet God, we never get there. We'll never meet God unless, still are going back to Dallas Willard says, unless we meet God exactly where we are. I mean, Jesus didn't just enter into kind of a non-stop, walking 10 feet above the ground. Like, Jesus entered into the cussedness of life. And so if we do not meet God there, then we will spend most of our life frustrated and not meeting God, not being formed.
You keep saying, I struggle to meet God in the cussedness of ordinary life. But I think if you read the monastic tradition, in particular, I'm thinking here the Desert Fathers and Mothers, discipleship itself is a struggle. And it's designed to be so. I mean, even in a secular psychological kind of framework, there's a whole theory of thought that without struggle, we don't ever become a self, that the personality itself is developed through conflict. And without it, you'd be a non-person, And there's certainly, I think, a Christian analog to that. And so the struggle to find God in the ordinariness of life is the struggle of discipleship. That is the path that we walk.
Yeah, there's this concept from Aquinas that's become really important to me of the idea of an arduous good.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that.
All arduous good is typically like the most difficult things in our life. The parenthood is an arduous good. It's good, but it is like deeply arduous.
Yes.
But running a marathon is an arduous good.
Writing a book, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. The person I learned this from has taken a vow of celibacy. And that is what he was talking about in terms of being an arduous good.
Yeah.
And I love this idea, and I bring it up a lot because I'm not sure our culture has a great understanding of it. I write, for the New York Times, and I can tell you when I bring this up, I get lots of pushback because there's sort of an idea of if it's good, it's not arduous, or it shouldn't feel hard or bad.
Well, goodness is being replaced by pleasure.
Yeah.
At some level.
But what you're talking about here with the struggle is part of how we're formed, is that there is an arduousness to good that is good for us, right?
Right.
And so I think the tricky part of the Christian life, and it's not like I've figured this out, is since it is a struggle, since it is it is arduous, it is a narrow way. Like, what does it mean to be honest about that and to live that out and to have joy, and not just have joy kind of in spite of that struggle, but what does it mean to glory, to enjoy the struggle of the Christian life, knowing that it's sort of like, in other words, there's different kinds of hardness, right? Like dancing is difficult, especially if you are dancing well. Running is difficult, biking is difficult, but there's a joy to that versus like moving a piano. Like, no,
What? That's not your go-to for joy.
And so I think what I'm saying is, don't get me wrong, there are absolutely times in the Christian life where it feels like you're just barely hanging on. You're moving a piano, and sometimes that has to happen. But how do we kind of hold together arduousness and rigor and joy?
How about, to round out our conversation, I want to get you to riff on two things: the body, and then tied to that, rest. The end of that paragraph I quoted about how so much of life unavoidably is just maintenance. You write, follow-up line, this is especially true of our bodies. Then you write, having a body is a lot of work. And then you write, the way we use our bodies teaches us what our bodies are for. There are plenty of messages in our culture about this. The proliferation of pornography and sexually driven advertising trains us to understand bodies, ours and other people's, primarily as a means of conquest or pleasure. We are told that our bodies are meant to be used and abused, or on the other hand, that our bodies are meant to be worshipped. If the church does not teach us what our bodies are for, our culture certainly will. If we don't learn to live the Christian life as embodied beings, worshiping God and stewarding the good gift of our bodies, we will learn a false gospel and alternative liturgy of the body. So, man, riff for me on just, I don't think you can do this vision that you're kind of laying out of finding God in the ordinariness of life. I don't think you can do that if you don't have, a theology of the body and some kind of even liturgical approach to the body. If you adopt a secular kind of the body is the pleasure sack view of the body. So riff on us. I don't think a lot of Christians in the West have a very robust theology of the body, and which is why they don't have a theology of habit, which is why we're so deficient in formation.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think in some ways we were talking earlier about how post-Enlightenment gives us this understanding of the human person that's kind of stripped down, brain on a stick. And so you can tell the story of the history of the West, including the church in many ways, as a story of forgetting that the body matters. The story of sort of leaving our bodies, quote unquote, behind. If we could somehow take a time machine and you and I drop into a worship service in the early church, I think we would be amazed at how embodied it looked.
Yes.
It would look more like a yoga class than it would like,
yes.
A moment of silence or whatever we do in church now.
I'm going to interrupt you, but before you keep going, I just was reading about an early church gathering. I was reading a church historian, and he was writing about how at every point in the weekly worship gathering, the whole congregation would turn and face to the east.
That's right.
And pray to the east, because that was the direction of Christ's return, and it's symbolic. That's where the sun would come up. And so it became this metaphor for light over darkness and resurrection, and God dragged the age to come into the present age. So just the last few days, this was, not even a week ago, in my morning prayer time, I sit in front of this window, but it's at a corner of our house. So there's two windows. So I just changed my window, and I've been praying to the east. I did it this morning. I got down on my knees and I prayed to the east. And I thought, this is so weird. Like there's that little kid in me that grew up in West Coast evangelicalism. It's like, what are you doing? Get your Bible study, study Bible out.
Yeah.
But I just prayed to the east, and it was this embodied sense of hopefulness came over me, and the sun was literally coming up. Anyway, so back to what you're saying,
totally.
Church is more like a yoga class. That felt like a good example of what you're saying.
Yeah. It's just today I'm working on a book on Advent that's coming out later this year, and I suggest, why don't you try, just on a lark, just try to sort of experiment with praying towards the east. Just because this is how the early church, and it's theologically rich. They understood Eden to be a garden in the east, so it's facing Eden and the return of Eden. But it's weird also. I never...
It's not that weird, but it is.
The direction that you prayed, made any difference at all. And it's not, I want to be clear, it's not like I think God hears your prayers less.
No, it's more for me. Yeah.
Exactly. It's your formation. It's your body matters. But also things like the church would stand and lift their hands to worship, or they would lay down, face down, or they would kneel, which are some practices that we do, particularly more like charismatic folks. But the idea of kneeling together,
they matter. My pastor Tyler Staton just gave a sermon on this, and he was talking about exactly what you said: posture in prayer. How the traditional Hebrew posture for prayer is actually standing with your arms up. And he said the same thing. It's not like God's hearing you more when you're standing than when you're sitting. But he had this great line. He said, because we are embodied beings with wandering minds,
that's right.
Posture matters in prayer.
I just think that formation is so inescapably a bodily act. And this is so evident if you have children, that they learn things with their bodies before they learn, before they can even articulate them. This is a very tiny example from just today, and it may not work because it's a brand new example. You can cut it out if it doesn't. But I have a 2-year-old little boy, and he's the baby of the family, and he is babied. Man, he is like...
What's his name?
His name is Gus. His name's Augustine.
Oh, what a great name. So that's like...
You call him Gus.
That's the Anglican and the Texas coming together. Augustine called Gus.
Yes.
It's an Anglican in Texas right there.
And so, yeah, that's exactly right. We actually named him Augustine, and I was like, we have to have a name my father, super Texan father, will say.
Blue collar Texan dad wouldn't love Augustine, you know? Yeah.
So Gus, today got new shoes. He got these, and he picked them out himself at the store, and they're these teeny tiny red Converse high tops. And they look like big boy shoes. They look like shoes that his sister wears. So he picks them out, he puts them on, and my husband told me as soon as he put on these shoes, it was like he decided he was a big boy. So he put himself in the car seat for the first time ever. I don't know, it was like 3 or 4 things that he did all by himself for the first time. But it's because through his body, he decided that he was now growing up, right? That he was no longer a baby anymore. And we didn't sit him down and tell him, you're no longer a baby. It was like this bodily experience. And you see that so much. There's tons of now, scholarly information about how we learn through our bodies. We experience trauma in our bodies.
Carry memory in our bodies, yeah. Including sin. I mean, so much of sin, to put like a neurobiological explanation, it's just the automatic responses of learned behavior in your body.
That's right. And so when you look at the early church, they have this, it's 2,000 years ago, but they have these deeply sophisticated understandings of how formation happens through the body. And because it was such a pre-literate culture, a lot of intentional formation of the church was bodily. And I think, first of all of this matters because it's all teaching us and forming us. And I will say, so we understand this with children. I see this with my son all the time. But we also, corporations understand this in a way the church has yet to catch on to. Like, I say this in the book, but I bring up the example that for a long time when I woke up in the morning, the first thing I did was grab my smartphone. That was an embodied formational experience that was designed. This phone was designed to fit in my body a certain way, to have a neurological, like neuron receptor response in a certain way.
To form you in a certain way. It's trying to make you into a particular kind of person.
Yeah. And what's the guy that formed Apple? Steve Jobs has never asked me or required me to say a creed. I do not wake up in the morning and say, I believe in Steve Jobs, maker of heaven and earth. He doesn't need it because I wake up in the morning and grab my smartphone first thing.
To the alarm on your smartphone or whatever.
Yeah. Now my smartphone's banned from my room, but for a long time, I didn't have a creed of that, but formationally.
Well, it's the whole thing. You did have a creed. It's like you did have a rule of life. You just didn't realize that you had a rule of life. You did have a creed. You just didn't realize it.
And it came through my body is the point. And engineers understand that. Corporations understand that. Sex sells not because we are like cognitively thinking about some, how sex sells, but because there's a bodily response to a commercial.
Yeah.
That makes us want Coca-Cola, even though it has nothing to do with sex. But we have a bodily response. And so the church is very behind in thinking about this. And it concerns me because I would say that at this point, there's so much when you look at our culture, that our culture is so much of the kind of sin and struggles that our culture is dealing with has to do with the body, right? Sexuality, everything, all kinds of digital Gnosticism, breaking us sort of further and further away from our bodies. And then the church's response to that is often like, hey guys, let's talk to the youth group about how, they shouldn't have sex before marriage. Let's give people like more information.
Yeah.
But everything that we're actually doing in church often sends a message that your body sort of doesn't matter. What matters is like having the right information. But things like, here's what I'm saying. We don't learn to counter the messages of the culture about our bodies by having different cognitive messages about our bodies. We learn that our bodies are instruments of worship by actually worshiping with and through
embodied practices.
Yes, and we're not going to be able to encounter embodied practices of the culture through disembodied information about the body.
Right.
We have to respond to embodied messages of the culture with embodied messages of Christian formation.
Wow.
Not just messages, but embodied practices.
Counter practices. I mean, my whole thing is all formation is counter formation.
That's right. And it has to be bodily.
Yes.
It can't just be more information about how Christians use their bodies, right? We have to actually use our bodies. So I think that this is probably one of the chief challenges and also needs of the coming generation is to reconnect our churches with their bodies. And there's so many ethical, you could have a whole, there's so many ethical spinouts of this, of our bodies mattering, of other human beings' bodies mattering, of all of a sudden things like the way we use food and the way we use screens and the way we use sex and the way we understand gender and the way that we buy fair trade coffee versus not fair trade coffee, all these things that seem like sort of like disconnected or like different kind of ethical and political ideas, maybe even different teams have different thoughts on these ideas, you start to see, oh my goodness, what they all have in common is this deep assumption that physical things don't matter. And so we need to kind of, as a church, recall the idea that physical things matter. And so it has deep implications for sexual ethics, but it also has deep implications for kind of like how we interact with capitalism and how we interact with food and how we interact with like the bodies of the weak and how we interact with issues of race and ethnicity.
You're saying all of that comes back to the theology of the body.
That's exactly right.
And it's, what I think what's lost, and, sex would be a great example of this, but there's many others, because the culture has such a high worship of pleasure. So there's this like bodily hedonism that is like a religion in our culture. But what people miss is it actually has an incredibly low view of the body. The body is just the pleasure sack, the meat sack, the do whatever you want with it, malleable for your inner self to, project your identity onto, rather than holding as the body as sacred, as designed by God, as infinitely precious, which means what you do with it is also sacred,
Everything we do with our bodies touches our souls and shapes our souls. It's not just that bodies matter. It's that when we do something with our body, we are doing it with our souls.
Yeah. And it's doing something to our souls.
That's right. Human beings are not just kind of souls with bodies, but we're also not like bodies with souls. We're this really complex body-soul.
I know.
Inseparable complex. And I think we need to hold together that kind of complex understanding of the human person.
Yeah. Yeah, when I teach on this, I like to say, theologically, you don't have a body, you are a body. And you always see people like, wait, what? Like just meaning your body is a part of who you are. It's not a container to carry around you. That's actually the Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment kind of Freudian view. Your body is a part of who you are. you know? This is why I shy away from the moniker of spiritual disciplines, not because I'm against them, but I just don't like that name because most people misunderstand what spiritual is and don't realize that word isn't even used in Hebrew at all. It's not in your Old Testament. And in the New Testament, it doesn't mean what most people mean by it today, which is either like allegorical or emotional or internal or invisible. It means animated by the Spirit of God, which is why Paul writes about how you can have a spiritual body. And he doesn't mean like a not physical body. He means you can have a body that is animated by the Spirit of God. So the problem actually isn't with the word spiritual, it's that with the misunderstanding of the word spiritual across the kind of, modern church. So I kind of shy away from that language because most of the quote spiritual disciplines are things you do with your body. Worship, Sabbath, community, the Lord's Supper, eating, drinking. I mean, these are embodied practices by which you offer your whole self, body and soul, over to God, So to end, I would love to hear you riff about just one embodied practice / spiritual discipline. In particular, at the end of your book, you have a chapter that you title Sleeping, Sabbath, Rest, and the Work of God. And we're doing a bunch of work right now around Sabbath. And so I would love to round our conversation off with, I think there's a connection here between body, what you said earlier about joy, and the arduous good, and there's a version of it that's just arduous, and there's a version of it that's joyful. And I think there's a tie in between that through line and the need for rest. And you write this in your opening page: we need a ritual and routine to learn to fall asleep. Infants learn by habit over time how to cease fighting sleepiness. A regular bedtime, dim lights, bath time, book time, rocking allow their brains to carve out a pattern, a biochemical path to rest. That, as a parent, that was like, oh my gosh, yes, children aren't born knowing how to sleep. They have to be taught. Without a ritual and routine, they become hyperactive and often exhibit behavioral problems. Adults aren't that much different. I'm certainly not. If rest is learned through habit and repetition, so is restlessness. These habits of rest or restlessness form us over time. Would you just expand on that, in particular with an eye towards Sabbath?
I don't know how much more I have to say about that than what you just read. I would say, so...
Well, that was really good.
I'll just talk about the Sabbath. I didn't grow up keeping a Sabbath. Like, Sabbath was not something I even had heard of. I'm the daughter of 2 real estate agents, and so Sunday was like open house day. It was like super work day. And in seminary, in my early 20s, my husband, I hope he's okay with me saying this, because this is no longer true. I mean, I've honestly seen massive change in his life. But when we got married, he was kind of a workaholic. And we were both in school. We were both in seminary, which, as you know, I mean, it's one of those things like being a writer or a pastor that it just fills up the time you give it. There's no end.
Yeah.
You can just keep learning. And so it was bad. And so I ended up reading this book, Keeping the Sabbath Holy by Marva Dawn.
Marva Dawn. Yeah.
And
it's amazing.
Saved my marriage. I mean, it genuinely did. I think we would have gotten divorced without it. And or possibly. I don't know. I don't want to be dramatic here, but it certainly improved things a lot and just changed our orientation to time in such an important way. That carving out that day a week where we just said there's not going to be work on this day, and we're going to rest, we're going to pray, we're going to play, has really ended up marking our, I mean, now we're 20 years of marriage, and we've been doing it for 20 years now. Talk about embodied. My body gets in this state. We start Sabbath on Sunday afternoons, and my body gets in this state. I'm like a drunk person, in the sense of like I just shut down, and when I try then to do stuff on Sundays, like it's at this point the learned rhythm of 20 years, like it's not going to happen. And so we nap, we have times of quiet in our house. We go on hikes. We have dinner sometimes with friends. And it's just really a day to chill out. It's looked really different over the years. 20 years is a long time. So it's looked really different. There's been sometimes we've been really strict about it. Particularly me, I admittedly can be a little bit puritanical about my Sabbath keeping. But it's like puritanical about pleasure. It's like insisting on goodness.
I'm the same. It's too good to let other things encroach on it,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. It's obviously looked really different when we had little tiny kids. My kids had to sort of learn the expectations of that. I mean, my 12-year-old now expects to be, she has little rituals that she does on Sundays, that she goes into a room and draws mostly. So it's looked really different over the years. And there's been times we've sort of been loosey-goosey with it and then got too loosey-goosey with it and had to sort of rein it back in. So it's looked really different, but it's been a gift. I would say it's probably one of the more countercultural practices that one can embrace in our moment of history. In a world that says we are the makers and sustainers of the universe, we are the ones that make our own lives, to say, I'm not done with this. And it's set, I'm not done with whatever this is, this work or this house or this, and it's Saturday night and I'm just going to not finish, or I'm just going to I'm going to rest. It's a arduous practice at times, but it's been a joy. And I talk in that chapter about the Scottish preacher that said, if we don't believe that God is at work when we're asleep, or when we are at rest, when we're not at work, then it reveals who we think is the actual worker in our own life, who we think is actually at the wheel, so to speak, of our own life. And I think Sabbath keeping is revelatory in that sense. It kind of reveals to me who I rely on, which is usually myself, or technology, or entertainment. And when we kind of take away, or commerce, and when we intentionally take breaks from commerce, from technology, from entertainment, from our own work, it's just a very kind of gentle way to wean us off of the things we rely on. But also, at this point, it's fun. I love to rest on Sundays. I think it was you that I got this from. Don't you make a distinction between, I can't remember your language. It's uphill practices and downhill practices?
Yeah, but that's not original to me. Yes, that's AJ Sherrill's where I stole that from. So thank you, AJ, for listening.
But I think this is a fun one. This is
Yes. And the backstory there is just some disciplines or practices are upstream for us, meaning for our personality type or stage of life, they're just incredibly difficult. They don't come naturally. They're not easy for us. Other disciplines or practices are downstream, meaning they're just so wired for our personality, or we love them, or they're just really easy. So if you're an introvert, solitude might be more of a downstream discipline, and community might be more upstream. If you're extrovert, opposite, So you're saying, am I hearing you say Sabbath is a downstream discipline for you?
Yes. And it's become more and more so over the years. As your body kind of gets into this rhythm.
Yes.
You just, I really genuinely just sort of shut down on Sundays.
Yeah, I'm the same. That's really interesting to hear you reflect on that. I feel like you are naming what I'm experiencing in my own body, but had not put language to, of your body begins to live in this rhythm, and even your soul in your way of being with God. I know even in my marriage, Wednesday night is date night, and we always have a really good connection on Sabbath and then another one midweek. And so I kind of know in those middle days, we don't have much of a connection because we're both working and we're doing our things, you just kind of have this rhythm of you still feel connected because this touch point's coming. I know it's different with God because he's with us 24/7, but there is even a cadence, not just in our body between work and rest, but in our soul between kind of communion with God, you know?
Practicing the Way is a crowd-funded non-profit made possible by The Circle, a group of people from all over the world. We believe deeply in the work of spiritual formation and discipleship, and so give monthly to see this integrated into the church at large. I'm Luke from the UK, and I'm part of this great community. To join myself and others in The Circle, or to share a one-time gift, visit practicingtheway.org/give.
So something that can be a little sad for me in our contemporary moment is that Sabbath rest has come to be understood so individually that it's kind of my day of rest, or it could just seem like, this like privileged luxury. But this historically was deeply communal. The church rested together. So it was a day where, maybe you all go home and take a nap, but then there's also like, you gather, you have friends, you have a feast, which for introverts,
throw a party, you eat together.
Which I am an introvert. That might sound like, oh my gosh, that's like exhausting. But I think we need to be around like our easy friends, like our easy family on Sundays, and particularly during feast seasons. And this helps, like, introvert extroversion is really balanced well by like feast, like Christmas and Easter, feasting with friends. And and so there was that element that the Lord's Day was something always kept together. But then because of that, there was a justice element to this, that we don't just cease working so that we can like have a spa day. We cease working so that others can cease working, so that we don't, in the end, only see the poor, other people's bodies, as something to kind of serve us, but that rest is given to everyone by God. And so we extend rest to everyone who we can in God. And honestly, like, I don't even know what this means to keep this now. Like, what does this mean when we have, people working in chicken factories 7 days a week, 24 hours a day? What does this mean in a globally connected world where we have, internet server farms and that sort of thing? I don't know. Like, when we have people at every moment have to be like cleaning up the dark web, what does this look like? I don't have an answer to that, but I do want to say there should be we need to kind of rediscover the communal element of the Sabbath, both with churches keeping it together, together keeping the Sabbath, but also that there's kind of a always in the Old Testament, the call to rest is this like radical call to treat workers with dignity. And so there is a justice element of treating workers with dignity, but also like laying down our fights for a day, like in our cultural polarization, where it's conceived that if you spend 1 second not calling people out on Twitter, that you're tepid about justice. Like, what does it mean for us to cease from our even political striving and actually like make room as a community to be just a human being with limitations, with longings, the desire to rest and to play, and to then extend that same courtesy of being a human being with limitations to other people, particularly those that aren't privileged. I don't know what that looks like, but I do feel like that's where the church needs to kind of press in on Sabbath, so that it's not sort of spun through just a deeply individualistic lens.
Like the millennial wellness culture or something, rather than community of justice and worship.
Yeah. Community of justice and worship and rest and joy and feasting.
What's your line? A counterculture community of the well-rested.
Yeah.
Love that line.
Countercultural community of the well-rested. And that's, every single Sunday, like the church history would understand, every single Sunday is a feast day. Every single Sunday is a chance to celebrate the resurrection. So what's it mean to like embody and practice resurrection every single Sunday together? I don't know the answer to that, but I think your distinction there of kind of wellness culture versus like a community of justice and joy, that I think that there's something there. Even that there's a practice that can hold together both justice and joy. That's not something our culture does. Like, justice has become this sort of like really angry, calling out culture. What does it mean for like rest and joy and goodness and beauty and justice to come together?
Wow.
Anyway.
I think we'll end there because that's really beautiful.
Thanks.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your writing. Thank you for your fidelity to Jesus and your family and your husband and orthodoxy and all the things. We're just so incredibly grateful for you.